I want to talk about the key things that the Declaration of Independence did. And this could be the most controversial. The first thing, and this will be alarming again to the traditional narrative, it justifies the armed overthrow of one's government. Enough said.
Good evening and welcome to the July 2016 Oakland County Campaign for Liberty Action Briefing at Shields Pizza in Troy, Michigan. Ladies and gentlemen, he's done fantastic work. He's coming up here. He has a tremendous level of knowledge. I tell you what, right now, I want to invite my good friend, your good friend, a friend of Liberty, Dave Benner. Dave, come on down.
All right, thank you. Thanks everyone for having me today. This is fantastic. I can't wait to eat the pizza. That will be excellent. And this is actually my first time in Michigan, although I am a lifelong Red Wings fan.
Yay!
It's unfortunate what happened with Datsuk, but hopefully still the team can reconcile that. So, I just want to give a real quick introduction. I write articles for the Abbeville Institute and the 10th Amendment Center, just like Shane and Todd do, and I actually have never met them in the flesh, so this is fantastic. I am a Jeffersonian historian. I believe in dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery. Yeah, thank you. And I like to introduce myself also by saying I'm really the only guy that goes around and talks about the founding era and the Constitution that has Thomas Jefferson tattooed onto my legs. So that's the claim to fame. So today I wanted to talk about the Declaration of Independence, but really at the heart of it was a constitutional crisis. And this constitutional crisis culminated with a decision individually amongst the states to depart from the governmental arrangement that they lived under. So I wanted to talk about the route that they went through as states to get to that point, what the Declaration really was and what it wasn't actually, because I promise you I will completely challenge the traditional narrative of the Declaration of Independence tonight. So first, let's do a gallop through what's called the Imperial Crisis. So, in 1765, I guarantee everyone in here has heard of the Stamp Act, which was imposed by British Parliament. Britain, at the time, had recently gotten through a successful war with France, the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War being the North American theater. And they had decided, for really the first time, to tax the colonists. Because what they saw, what the British perspective was, and this is simplifying things, but they saw that the states, they considered them to be the sole beneficiaries from this successful war, because they wouldn't have to deal with Indian raids and hostilities. The French had to give up many land claims. So what they do was they imposed the Stamp Act, and everyone knows what the Stamp Act was. It was a stamp based on paper with an image of King George III to be on all papers and playing cards, every paper object. So how did they respond to this? Well, the states didn't all respond in a uniform way to this, but they did call up a convention where 9 states met at what's called the Stamp Act Congress. And in the Stamp Act Congress, what happened was the states decided to criticize these acts. They called them unauthoritative, but they did it in kind of a sly way. They first said, we respect the king, we acknowledge the office of the king, and we believe and adhere to the Protestant succession. So we really have all the same responsibilities as Englishmen. But here's what also did they say. We also have all the same rights as Englishmen. And those rights went all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215. The king can't just levy taxes based on his own prerogative. Taxes actually had to be levied from the people's representatives. So this Stamp Act Resolves, so it was called, was passed. And in the midst of all this, controversy actually erupted locally in Britain over the Stamp Act. Some people were not willing to try to continue to enforce it, and really the enforcement totally failed. The states essentially nullified the Stamp Act.
Yay! Let's give a round of applause.
Nullification, that's right. So they did that. And merchants complained. You know why? Because people boycotted British goods. They would not buy British goods because of this. So they boycotted. And the boycotts became so strong and so persuasive to the British government that the British government actually ended up repealing the Stamp Act the next year in 1766. And on the same day, though, they passed the Declaratory Act, an act which reiterated the fact that parliamentary law was binding upon the colonies, quote, in all ways whatsoever. And that was the most devastating aspect of this time, was not the fact that the policies were particularly terrible, but the fact that they were being imposed on polities that did not recognize that legislature. Because the British position was, well, we had this little event in 1688 called the Glorious Revolution, whereupon after we kicked out King James II, the joint monarchy of William and Mary had to take an oath to swear that Parliament was sovereign, and Parliament could dictate everything. Well, the states did not accept that, but for the time, passions subdued. Then we get to, and I'm skipping many important items, but I'm trying to gallop my way through this, is the Tea Party. We think of Tea Party as kind of a singular incident, but it really wasn't. Actually, the states behaved very differently according to their response to the Tea Party, or the Tea Act, the 1773 Tea Act. And what had happened there was the British East India Tea Company had gone bankrupt. So they did what many corporations still today do. They begged government for a bailout. They groveled, right? We haven't seen that before in our lifetimes, right? So it's shocking. So in Boston, you had patriots that dressed up as Mohawk Indians and dumped the tea into the harbor, famously, of course. But in Annapolis, the tea was burned on the docks. In Philadelphia and New York, they shipped the tea back. So again, they're nullifying British policies. They could not enforce this thing. It became impossible to enforce. Well, I mean, after this happened, this enraged the British government, especially Massachusetts Act. It was considered the most incendiary. So the British government passed the Intolerable Acts, otherwise called as the Coercive Acts. Among the coercive acts was an act that reformed Massachusetts colonial government. It made it so that the king could pick members to fill one of the houses of the legislature. I keep screwing that word up. The other thing was the Boston Port Act. It closed down the Boston port to any foreign trade. So this devastated Boston, and you can read about this in all the accounts of the time. It really caused mass starvation. The maritime industry of trade could just going by the wayside, completely devastated the local economy. The Quartering Act as well, so the government decided that it's going to quarter, sometimes it was called billeting, soldiers in the houses of colonists during wartime. This led to the apprehension that Britain was establishing a standing army that could potentially disarm the citizens. And they came up with crafty ways to try to disarm them, by the way. Not what you would typically consider disarmament in the traditional sense, but they realized that, an outright initial confiscation of firearms would, be completely unpopular and detested. So what did they do? They went after munitions, actually gunpowder stores. So you can read about the powder alarm incident, for instance, in 1774, where the British tried to stop people from being armed in crafty ways. What are they trying to do today? They try to limit certain munitions, certain firearms. They try the same crafty tricks again. So again, hostilities eventually erupted at Lexington and Concord, and, well, how to handle this. A Continental Congress was formed amongst the states to determine what to do. And actually, initially, no one wanted to, raise up arms against the British government, for the most part. Maybe John Adams. Some of the Massachusetts delegation definitely did. But no, we wanted to seek remediation through peaceful means. We wanted to maybe see if King George III could intervene on behalf of the colonies and stop Parliament from their tyrannical acts. So what you had was an effort spearheaded by people like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, one of the most popular people of the time, by the way, to try to write these texts to the king and try to seek, remediation. One such attempt was called the Olive Branch Petition, and this was an effort to, sway King George III to the favor of the colonies. Well, it failed for two reasons. One, John Adams, a letter from John Adams was actually intercepted where he doubted that that was a sincere effort and really stated that war was inevitable. And then the other thing was the king didn't recognize the legitimacy of this Continental Congress and the states that encompassed it, comprised it, I should say. So what you had was the Second Continental Congress getting together and determining what to do. And keep in mind, before the Declaration of Independence was adopted, fighting had been breaking out for about 14 months. So the war had been ongoing since Lexington and Concord. But why did it take that long for the states to decide to declare independence? That is a common question. But the answer is, it was considered by many to be a local matter. A lot of the states did not want the British government to treat their state like they had Britain. Again, John Dickinson was one of the people that most could not take that prospect. They really destroyed Massachusetts' livelihood through these acts and through the occupation, the appearance of a standing army, disarmament, quartering, like I said. So what did they do? Well, a few states before the Declaration declared independence. So Rhode Island and Virginia, before the traditional July 2nd, 1776 date, declared independence individually. But not all states were on board yet. So actually, in the Continental Congress, what happened was they went on recess. A recess was called in June, whereupon the representatives of the states, and by the way, they voted on all issues based on state quorum, not individually. They went back to their states to get instructions on what to do. Should we declare independence? That was an open question at the time. Again, not every representative wanted to do that. Well, in the meantime, Thomas Jefferson was assigned to write this famous document, right? And there was a reason for that. Actually, the committee chairman that was responsible for producing the text, John Adams, chose Jefferson, according to himself in later age, for three reasons. One, Jefferson was a Virginian, and he thought that a Virginian should be at the head of this thing. It was the most significant state. Number two, John Adams understood himself to be obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. That's his own words, by the way. And the third was that Jefferson had a known talent for his pen, and this was demonstrated in the 1774 pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America, which John Adams had read, and many of that generation had read and very much admired. So really, there was a long road to this point, and it took Jefferson 17 days to write it, and the committee was 5 people: John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and Benjamin Franklin. And that was the committee. Now, I want to talk about the key things that the Declaration of Independence did. And this, this could be the most controversial. All right. So, the first thing, and this will be alarming again to the traditional narrative, it justifies the armed overthrow of one's government. Enough said, right? When do you hear that suggestion today? But this was openly discussed at the time. Jefferson wrote, "Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it." And that was a radical idea. Right? The other thing that Jefferson went, that took that to a further level was he said that it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government when it becomes tyrannical. And really, Jefferson said that a long train of usurpations, all having the direct result of creating an absolute tyranny over these states, justified it. And they weren't talking they weren't talking the abolishment of one's government through petty insults, elections, things like that. That would have been improbable and impossible. The other thing that Jefferson said was there are certain unalienable rights that predate government. They pre-exist the political process, they pre-exist government. They are natural rights. We have them because we are born with them, whether you believe in God or whether you believe that they're an innate extension of one's humanity is essentially immaterial to me. Just that theory was an important and prominent one, and we've lost that too. Now many people think that government's necessary for these rights. No. Jefferson did favor the social compact theory of John Locke, which really differed from that of Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And I don't want to get too into that right now, but I'll just say that generally Hobbes and Rousseau thought that in a state of nature, this hypothetical situation before governments were formed, men were essentially barbaric and lawless, and they could not be they could not behave correctly. And John Locke really questioned that. He said that in a state of nature, men actually acted fairly lawfully, but government could be formed to protect rights. And to Jefferson, that was the only legitimate reason that government should be born, is to protect rights. Now, what do people say? We want this handout. We want this company to be bailed out. We want this to be paid for at the expense of someone else. We want this person to be extorted on behalf of someone else.
Or you want this illegal, immoral war started on behalf of somebody else.
Exactly. So there you go. So Jefferson really favored Locke, and most of the representatives in this time favored Locke's interpretation of the social compact theory in comparison. The other thing was Jefferson obviously listed a number of key charges against King George III. And this list was actually oddly reminiscent of the Grand Remonstrance of 1641, which was an indictment that parliamentarians had created against Charles I, Charles Stuart. And in the words of John Pym, the author of that document, Charles Stuart had created a government that consisted of, quote, a malignant and pernicious design. Well, such was kind of similar to the case in this matter, and I'm just going to go through these. And when you read these, you can kind of view them in a contemporary consideration. It's eerie how many could apply to today. And my favorite one is, he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of public servants to harass our people and eat out their substance. So I don't see how you could draw any parallels to the IRS or TSA there. No way. He is kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislature, and he is affected to render the military independent and superior to the civil power. Actually, when the states created their own constitutions, they countered this directly by saying that their state militias were inferior to the civil power. And the appearance of a standing army is really what completely agitated Massachusetts, especially. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. This one's obvious. Again, it goes back to the Magna Carta, and this was reiterated in 1628 in the British Petition of Right, because they said King Charles I is trying to levy a callous tax, it was called ship money, without the consent of representatives. Actually, Charles just prorogued the legislature. He dissolved it so he could rule alone to do that. And has anyone heard Chris Ann Hall talk about this, by the way? Yeah, she talks about that a lot. That's fantastic. So, Jefferson's work endured 2 days of editing by the Continental Congress, and this he actually kind of detested. Some of the wording was changed a little bit, but the biggest change was actually Jefferson created a long and incendiary indictment upon the slave trade, and he placed the responsibility for instituting the slave trade solely upon the British government, saying that King George III has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him. And goes on from there. So that was one of the major issues. Life, liberty, and property were Lockean. That comes from Locke's second treatise of government. That was changed slightly. Obviously, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sacred and undeniable was changed. They show that in the John Adams miniseries as a suggestion by Benjamin Franklin, but we don't really know that. We just see Benjamin Franklin's writing above that, so we don't really know the reasoning behind that. Let me talk about just one more influence here. Because like I said, before the Declaration of Independence and the Richard Henry Lee Amendment was actually adopted by the states on July 2nd. July 2nd really is our Independence Day if you were to make it a collectivized date, but it really isn't. The Declaration of Independence was just adopted on July 4th. John Adams actually thought that July 2nd would be the date we celebrate. Well, we don't. One more influence is George Mason. George Mason was the primary author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Virginia Constitution of 1776. Really, actually the first constitution written and ratified by the people's representatives in the world. There were other constitutions, but they weren't written and ratified by the people's representatives. So the purpose of the Declaration, why is it as it is, the number of words, etc. It was written specifically to be read aloud to public gatherings, and it was. Washington read it to his troops immediately upon its reception. It was read aloud to people curious outside of Independence Hall. It was read in the states individually. Also, it was written to create solidarity between the states, not because of a collectivization effort, but to try to secure foreign alliances and recognitions, which was eventually gained when Spain, France, and the Dutch decided to aid the cause in various ways. And again, this decision was made based on state quorums, where states made the ultimate decisions. You could have asked John Adams what he thought, and he said independence, but if the rest of the Massachusetts delegation didn't agree, it wouldn't have mattered because it was based on state quorum. All right, here will be the wrench to be thrown into the traditional narrative here. What the Declaration of Independence did not do. It did not establish a national political philosophy. Actually, on the contrary, it recognized a system of independent polities. If you read the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, it's clear that it's being announced that the states are, quote, free and independent states, each with the power to levy war, conclude peace, and do all things states right of ought to do. This is not a birth date for America. This is the departure from a governmental structure. So when people say the birthday of America is 1776, that's inaccurate. The Declaration of Independence actually didn't even create any kind of government, nor did it create any kind of union. The first time a federal union was established was the Articles of Confederation, which was not ratified until 1781. So the states declared independence individually. The Declaration served as a common cause declaration, but again, they declared it individually. And indeed, throwing another wrench into the political union narrative is that the states behaved completely independently during the entire war, by the way. For instance, Massachusetts and South Carolina and Connecticut, they fit and deployed warships without direction from the Continental Congress. Continental Congress could raise the Continental Army, but the militias were controlled by the states, and really the state governors took a lot of the duties to carry out those wars. In Connecticut took Fort Ticonderoga with the help of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. New Hampshire's governor had the ability to enact orders of marque and letters of marque and reprisal. So these independent powers were still held by the states after the Declaration. Again, it's not a birth date. The last section of the Declaration of Independence notes two important things. The first thing is that the states are independent from each other and also from other nations. And actually, Jefferson compares the condition of these states to, quote, the state of Great Britain. That is also a state. These were essentially independent nations. So when people say that this birthed a new country, no, it recognized 13 separate countries. Jefferson actually didn't become widely known as the author of the Declaration of Independence until the 1790s, by the way. It was at that time where it kind of became part of Jeffersonian symbolism when the Federalists under John Adams were behaving in what he considered to be unconstitutional ways. The Alien and Sedition Act and war with France, these were extremely controversial things. Under George Washington, too, the Jay Treaty was just detested by Jeffersonians. So Jefferson actually was not known as the author until a little bit later. The prominence of the Declaration of Independence actually did not gain such a great foothold until that time as well. And July 4th was actually celebrated as a partisan holiday for much of the early Republic history, because if you were a Jeffersonian that did not like the Federalists and the Federalist plan, they would celebrate that day. The Federalists generally celebrated George Washington's birthday instead. So this was actually a partisan holiday for some time, and that's a fact a lot of people don't know as well. So that's basically where I'll conclude. I'll just say that, when you were watching fireworks this weekend, I hope that you realize that, this was not a birth of the great nation state, a modern nation. This was a celebration of a departure from a structure, a government structure that the founders decided that it was right to leave, individually in the states. So that's where I'll end. I'll just say I do have my book. It's $15, less than Amazon. I'm not going to peddle or grovel or beg you to buy it, but if you liked what I talked about, feel free to pick one up. I'll have one until supplies last, and I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining. Sorry if I went a little bit over time.
No, it's great.
Appreciate you guys.